The war in Ukraine and over Ukraine is a complex business in which you have a bad actor on the one side, and this is Russia. Now, Russia is not entirely a bad actor in the sense that Russia has legitimate concerns about anti-Russian resistance on the Russian border. Just as we would have concerns if you had, for example, a heavily armed Mexico or even Canada. I realize hard to imagine a heavily armed Canada, but a heavily armed Mexico, let's say, threatening the U.S. on the southern border. This would make America very nervous, and America would demand certain conditions to make sure that its security was protected. Nevertheless, Putin did invade Ukraine. That is inexcusable. And the Ukrainians in this framework appear to be the good guys because they are fighting against a foreign country, and a very big foreign country that has invaded their borders. Now, it is a separate question about how this involves the United States. In some senses, we should feel a kind of solidarity toward Ukraine just because they're fighting for their own autonomy. But there are troubling issues here. Number one is the Ukraine war appears to be a kind of proxy war. I mean, think about it. Under normal circumstances, the Russians should have overrun Ukraine in about 3 weeks. But the reason that they don't and can't is because all of NATO is fighting through Ukraine against Russia. So there's a legitimate question: what is it our business, and to what degree should we commit our resources and our treasure and our taxpayer dollars in this faraway conflict? But Ukraine has nevertheless seemed relatively clean-cut. The victims are not the victimizers. And yet, from the beginning of the war, there were, on social media and even in some articles, a kind of noting that there are Nazi forces, neo-Nazis, fighting in the Ukraine resistance. And we're not talking here about the fact that here's one guy and he happens to be a neo-Nazi and he's a kook and he happened to sign up for the Ukrainian forces. No, we're talking about whole battalions. We're talking about neo-Nazis having a prominent and decorated place in the Ukraine military. We're talking about the fact that these are some of the most admired generals and soldiers in the country. So, in other words, we're talking about a somewhat Nazified Ukrainian resistance. Again, I saw a number of references to this, but was sort of not able to know the magnitude of it. But here's an interesting article just came out in the New York Times, June 5th, quote, "Nazi symbols on Ukraine's front lines highlight thorny issues of history." I want to go through this article in part because it represents really a breakthrough. For the first time, you have the mainstream left openly admitting something that they themselves, the media, has tried to suppress. Many of the so-called anti-hate groups in the United States, Jewish groups and Southern Poverty Law Center, they're always hunting for people in America and around the world who are using Nazi paraphernalia, swastikas, Nazi symbols. They know that these symbols are all over the place in the Ukraine conflict on the Ukrainian side, but they have been very reluctant to admit it. They have been reluctant to denounce it or even to point it out. Now, the New York Times article begins with the observation that the Ukrainian government and even NATO allies have been posting a bunch of memes in their social media feeds showing Ukrainian soldiers standing on tops of trucks, an emergency worker posing in front of a truck. And then people noticed, wait a minute, these memes contain explicit and unmistakable Nazi imagery. And so first the Ukrainian government deletes the memes, and then NATO allies delete the memes also. So in other words, they're trying to be coy or secretive about the fact that this Nazi presence, which obviously they know about. So, in each photograph, the Times writes, Ukrainians in uniform wore patches featuring symbols that were made notorious by Nazi Germany and have since become part of the iconography of far right. Far right. So we have this idea that the Nazis were far right. This is a trope on the left that goes back to World War II. The Nazis, in fact, were on the left, but they'll never admit this. So they love to throw in the far right label. But let's leave that to the side for here. The photographs and their deletions highlight the Ukrainian military's complicated relationship with Nazi imagery. I'll say complicated. Well, I think that if in the United States you had regiments of the police or the military that were using Nazi paraphernalia, doing, high Nazi salutes, wearing Nazi hats and symbols that are identified with Hitler and Himmler, this wouldn't be considered the cops in America have a complicated relationship to the Nazis. No, they would be denounced unequivocally and full-throatedly. So when we come back more about the Nazi presence in the Ukraine and how it developed and why the West is trying to hide it.